Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to BittersBBB Episode 2, the show where we learn to be better game designers, developers, and all-around good guys. I'm Bitters, and in this episode we'll be looking at the first moments of Bioware's sci-fi story action RPG, Mass Effect 2. The topic of discussion for Mass Effect 2 is the introduction of core game elements at the outset of the game. Games, like all things for an audience, attempt to capture the player's attention from the get-go, and the most obvious and effective way to do this is to show off what the game is about. This is where, as game developers, we can get a tad sidetracked by spending the game's introductory phase not actually introducing the game, but a facet we particularly like. To exemplify my point, let's go through the opening moments of Mass Effect 2 and how Bioware have managed to introduce core game elements early on. Now, the game knows what it is from the moment you hit New Game. The actual cinematic introduction for Mass Effect 2 takes place some setup after you venture beyond the title screen, because, if nothing else, Mass Effect 2 is a sequel to a budding franchise. How many games slap a big number 2 at the end of their title in order to simply boost sales and forgive the reuse of art assets? Bioware have smartly created a system to allow players to transfer their Mass Effect 1 saves into Mass Effect 2, and in doing so without even seeing a moment of gameplay, or even one up his Paragon, down his Renegade conversation wheel.
Cut to the chase.
The player recognises this is a sequel. Perhaps this doesn't apply to every game, but if you are selling a true sequel, it's best to quickly give the player the impression that they are playing a follow-up to the preceding title. The import feature also serves as a refresher to memory, as it highlights some key moments from Mass Effect 1 that the game plans to show off in the sequel. But let's discuss the actual introduction of Mass Effect 2, and Bioware show that they know what their game is on about. Mass Effect 2 opens with a cinematic showing off new story elements, including new allies, new enemies, and the background in which the sequel is set in. The game quickly follows up with a basic gameplay sequence and some RPG dialogue, before cutting through to every RPG's favourite "look, I'm an RPG" mechanic, the character builder. After allowing you to give Commander Shepard a face in a class, Mass Effect 2 runs through what could be considered a tutorial sequence disguised as the opening level, where we run through more movement, combat, enemies, and a whole host of mechanics that will prevail throughout the entire game. Good, Mass Effect 2 introduced everything early, but let's backtrack. Where do we set the game off with? A cinematic introduction. At the end of the day, Mass Effect 2 is not just an action RPG, but a story game. By this, I mean not a game that also has a story, but a game which is completely about the story. Many games open with a story introduction, but the story is actually simply a connector between moments of gameplay. Conversely, Mass Effect 2 opens with a story introduction because it views story as not a connector, but a motivator. The story is, arguably, the primary driving force of the game's progression. How does this affect the opening of the game though? It's feasible to debate that, even if the story was not actually a motivating force, but a connection between gameplay instances, the game would still be the same. Indeed, let's reverse engineer the potential thought processes of the following sequence.
What are you doing here? Thought you were still a work in progress.
I just woke up. You probably know more than I do.
Now, here we have two elements introduced: powers, or abilities, and Jacob. If we reverse engineer the potential design thoughts behind this moment using the story as a connector principle, then it may be something along the lines of, we need to introduce combat abilities early, so we should do so by giving the player access to a party member with usable combat ability. On the other hand, using the story as a motivator principle, it might be something along the lines of, Jacob is a new key character for the game, someone who will help get the player more on side with Cerberus. We should introduce him early, during the tutorial level, and thus pair his introduction with a gameplay element. Both lines of thought could easily lead to the same conclusion from the designer. However, when designing, it is important to make the distinction regarding what you're truly trying to introduce, so it receives the appropriate focus. As previously mentioned, Mass Effect 2 runs through a vast majority of its core elements, both gameplay and story, quite early on. It's impossible for a player to come out of the first half hour of gameplay here, and to not have created an expectation for how the remainder of the game will play out thanks to this introduction. But even then, Mass Effect 2, with regard to the majority of AAA titles released, is big. It has a story large enough to fill multiple choose-your-own-adventure paperbacks, and enough gameplay elements to justify its genre as an action RPG. So with all this in mind, it's impossible to introduce all central core elements of the game at once, and here, as game designers and developers, we need to take a moment to prioritise the introduction of said core elements. Certain elements must come after others in the grand scheme of things. To use the adage, you need to learn to walk before you can run, players need to learn how to move before they can shoot. Now let's run through the areas I would consider the introductory segment of Mass Effect 2, and how they prioritise the elements. With regard to the plot of the game, the science fiction theme is highlighted early, with the grandeur of space, floating data screens, and some scrolling text. All classic science fiction techniques. The first sequence also highlights a darker theme, with the introduction of a powerful enemy, props of fire, death, destruction and silence, and the sacrificial demise of our player character. Bioware here have correctly prioritised setting the theme of the game over specific details, thus immersing the player into a prepared mood for what follows. However, within a predominantly cinematic experience, Bioware has slipped in two core elements of the game. Both the two short conversation wheel sequences and movement through the Normandy could have actually been completely ignored, as giving the player control here provides no consequences regarding the remainder of the game. However, what these two elements have done is allow the player to begin their learning of the game. Oh, that sounds important, but why? Well, regardless of the level of difficulty within a game, players will naturally progress in skill as they play. The earlier a player can grasp the gameplay, the smoother they will progress through the game. Games that don't teach players these lessons early can give poor impressions of the difficulty curve throughout the game, and potentially turn off some players completely as they cannot grasp aspects of the gameplay. Your players shouldn't have to find an apple tree and hope an apple falls on their head to discover your game has gravity. It is actually alright to spoon feed them early in the game. Drop the apple on their head, they'll appreciate it. Harking back, why these two elements? And how can we see their expansion prioritised through the remainder of the learning portion of the game? Firstly, let's look at the movement. After Shepard's revival, movement is refreshed, and some further basic options are explored, such as interaction and cover, which ultimately lead to actual combat. Did you see that? Let's refresh. Players are first taught to move around, after which they're taught to interact. How does that link? Well, what can you interact with if you can't move towards interactable item? Following this, players are taught the cover mechanic. Oh, why would they do this early? Lo and behold, it's quickly followed up with a first enemy and a first taste of cover-based combat. This all sounds rather simple, but I assure you that should I create a flowchart of the order things are introduced, you'll see that the flowchart also teaches the prerequisites of these elements in the same order. Don't consider this as babying players through the game, unless you intentionally present it in a demeaning manner. Players aren't particularly expecting a challenging introduction, even in the most hardcore difficulty settings. But what about the conversation wheel? There isn't really an increase in skill requirements for the conversation wheel, so why does it feature so heavily early on? Well, this isn't actually a component Bioware are trying to make the player better at, but rather one they have decided to add on early for story reasons. As I've previously said, Mass Effect 2 is a story game, and was promoted with the intent that players could play it their own way. By introducing and expanding upon the choice of conversation, it smartly creates the impression of a player-run story experience, even though in reality there are a few major choices early in the game. As the first level finishes up and the second level takes off, a substantial number of other elements are introduced. However, given their priority of the introduction, it has already been categorized in the player's mind as lesser mechanics. Both of the hacking minigames, armor mechanics, further uses for abilities, interrupt system, boss battles, quests, and the new Normandy are all introduced before giving the player free reign over their path. Were all these mechanics truly considered important enough to exist in the tutorial levels? More correctly, the reasoning of this is because the mechanics will see a lot of use throughout the game. However, they are merely additions to the core concept of Mass Effect 2, the action RPG. So now that we've spent some time to analyse the opening of Bioware's game, let's recap on what we've learned here. Mass Effect 2 is a story-driven action RPG, which, through its introductory phase and tutorial levels, introduces core elements with priority. Bioware prioritised core elements in the following way. Firstly, theme and story, as highlighted by early cinematics. Secondly, the player-run role-playing experience and third-person action, as highlighted by early conversation wheels and early movement and combat tutorials. And finally, followed by elements which simply enhance one of the three aforementioned major core elements. Elements such as abilities, party characters, interrupts, etc. all serve to further story, role-playing, and third-person action. The lesson learned is that a game can prioritise its introductions to great effect in a flow of related core elements, drawing the player successfully and also correctly into the experience without leading them astray from the game you want to show them. And that wraps up our look into the introduction of core elements within Mass Effect 2, and the first episode of BittersBBB with some preparation. May all your game developing experiences be happy ones. See ya!